We're going to switch gears now and discuss bump mapping. Bump mapping is an attribute carried by common mined materials that allows you to create the illusion that a surface is rough or bumpy. For example, in this scene I have a primitive cube that's been scaled down. I want to make this look like a piece of wood or a plank or a board that might have been painted where the wood grain shows through, and that's a perfect place for a bump map. So use the bump mapping attribute and use a procedural texture. Now I also have two lights in this scene. I have a spotlight and a point light. I've added the point light just to give myself a nice shiny highlight so I can see the pattern. Now bump maps will not work with ambient lights, so keep that in mind. You have to use a spotlight, directional light, point light, or area light, or even a volume light to get the bump pattern to appear, but cannot use ambient light by itself. You can use ambient light as a fill, but you have to have one other light in there. So let's take a look at the material. I'm going to go to the hypershade, which I minimized. And here's the blend. I'm going to open up its attribute editor. And there it is. So far, the only thing that's been adjusted on this blend is just the color, which is red, and the specular shading attributes to make it have a nice hot specular highlight, but nothing else. So if I render this now, it's not going to be very exciting. It looks like a shiny, flat board with no grain whatsoever. So let's try a bump map. So I go to the bump mapping attribute, and you'll see that there's no color swatch, there's no slider in this case. That's because you do have to map this to make it work. So I'm going to go to the checkered map button, click that, and bring up the Create Render Node window. I'm going to go straight to 3D textures because I want to use the wood procedural texture in this case. Now the wood procedural texture creates a ring pattern like a tree trunk. It's not very good for a color map, however, because it's just not very realistic. However, if you use it as a bump, you can tweak it in such a way that you can create the illusion that that wood pattern is underneath some other layer, like a layer of paint. So I'm going to click that wood texture and bring that up. Now you'll notice in the attribute editor, what comes up is a node we haven't discussed, Bump 3D node. So let's look in the hypershade to figure out how that works. I'm going to go up to the blend and right mouse key and graph network to see the network. So you get your wood texture node. You also get your place 3D texture node for free because it is a 3D texture. We also get a bump 3D node in between. And what that node does is it takes values from the wood texture, passes them on to the actual material. The material will perturb the surface normals as it renders based on the values passed through the bump. And what that means is the surface normals are temporarily bumped or bent in such a way that an individual surface point will be considered in a valley or in a peak. And that creates the illusion of bumpiness. Now that normal tweaking only happens during the point of render. It does not affect the actual geometry, so the surface normals on the geometry are unaffected. So it's a trick during the rendering, which is great because you can create the illusion of bumpiness without having to build super high dense geometry. So let's give this a render and see what it looks like. You can already see that the icon is very rough looking here. So back to the render view. I'll dolly in so we can see that better. And there it is. In fact, it looks quite bumpy. Now, it might not be perfect initially. You do have to make a few adjustments. For one thing, I see that my wood pattern's being streaked across the wood. I can't really see the rings. Another thing, I think the pattern is probably too small. Now, since this is a 3D texture, what I can do is go back to the 3D placement box and scale and rotate and position that to try to help make that pattern better. So I'm going to grab that placement box, select that, and I'm going to scale it up to make the pattern not so small on my surface. I'm going to rotate it so it doesn't streak through. And I think if I rotate it roughly 45 degrees compared to where the board is, I think that should be a little bit better. So we'll give this a try. So the pattern has indeed got easier to see. It's not so small. However, I'm still seeing each section of rings here. You see kind of 4 little sections there, where I have just one big section on the wood. Now, one trick with the placement box is you can scale it unevenly. I can scale in one direction to stretch the pattern. So I scale it out long this way, and I'll dolly back in. You'll see the pattern has gotten streaked in such a way that it's less obvious where those edges of that pattern is. That's pretty good right now. Let's try that. So now I have this wood grain that's stretched along the long side of the board. Also appear on the sides as if the board got cut through. And again, to do that, what I did with my placement box is stretch it out really long compared to the length of the board and rotate it on its side roughly 45 degrees off the axis of the board. Now we should tweak the bump itself because it's pretty intense right now. It's so intense it looks a little bit rough. Now one thing I probably should do as I'm gauging this is check my anti-aliasing settings, which we talked about in previous videos. And some of this roughness is probably because I have low quality right now. So if I go up to my render settings window, using the shortcut to the render view, I'll go to the My Software tab and switch it from low quality to highest quality. And that will help me judge this more correctly. So I'll render it again. And now it doesn't look quite so ragged. Now it's still a little intense. These individual pits and grains on the wood are very, very deep. Looks like old rotten wood. So I'm going to reduce that by going back to the bump. I'll go to the bump 3D node, bring up the attribute editor for that. And the most important attribute is bump depth. Bump depth determines the depth of the bump map. So in other words, the height of the peaks and the deepness of the little valleys created by the bump map are controlled by this. So I can reduce this to a lower number like 0.1 and re-render that. And that's much more subtle. It makes it look like a glossy paint is covering the wood grain. It's not so rough. It's almost like the pattern's softer and it's just not so deep. And because of the point light in the scene, it gives me a nice hot spot right there because the point light's close to the surface. So that's 0.1 for the bump depth. Now you can go higher than 1 too if you want to, and that just increases the intensity. If I go up to 2, I get a really intense bump. You can go even higher than that if you want to. And that might be appropriate for certain textures and certain models, but I don't think I want to go that high in this case. So I'm going to go back to 0.1. I can also go to a negative number. In fact, let's try that. Let's try -1. What the negative value does is it inverts the bump. The peaks become valleys and the valleys become peaks. So now if I render that out, it's basically inverted. So that's one option, is to go to negative value. But again, I think 0.1 is good in this case. So back to 0.1. And there we go. So now that I've adjusted my placement box, because I was using a 3D texture, I've adjusted my bump depth. The last thing to adjust would be the attributes for the actual texture, the wood texture. Let's take a quick look at that. Open up the wood texture in the attribute editor, and there it is. Like all procedural textures, it will have a unique set of attributes. And for wood, they all basically have to do with how the rings are grown, because there are little circular rings. So the filler color is the color in between the rings. The vein color is the color of the rings themselves. Randomness affects the randomness of the rings, how uneven they are. So if I set that up to 1 and re-render, I'll get a slightly more regular pattern. There's also age, which affects the little age spots and how dense the rings are. The higher the age, the tighter the rings are together. So I go up to an age of 100, they're spaced more tightly together. There's also grain color, which affects the color of the little dots inside the pattern. Those little dots turn into the little tiny divots you see, the little tiny semicircular divots. There's also spacing of the grain, how close the grains are together. And there's a built-in noise, which affects the overall noisiness of the pattern, because like many procedural textures, this is based on a noise pattern that's generated by a mathematical formula. So those are the basic attributes. I would start with the 3D placement utility first to determine the general size of your wood pattern, and then go into the attributes to fine-tune it. Now keep in mind that as you adjust the placement utility, as you adjust the bump depth, and as you adjust the texture attributes, it may be necessary to go back to the material and fine-tune it. Once you have a bump, it might affect how your specular quality is or what your diffuse quality looks like, so it might be good to go back to those basic common attributes and fine-tune them. Because the way the surface reacts when it has a bump is a little bit different than the way it reacts when it's perfectly smooth. In this case, I think it looks pretty good. So there's your piece of wood, has a grain pattern in it, but looks like it's painted with some kind of glossy covering. This is going to be saved out as wood.mb in the chapter 14 folder.